In a previous video, we used this simple example here of a form which adds two numbers together, and we built this within the Angular front end to be able to add those two numbers together. If the values were not valid values for that to add it up, we would get an error message. And we did some unit and integration testing using Jasmine, which is the built-in testing framework for Angular, the Angular front end, to be able to do some testing, unit testing with that one. So today we're going to take the same sort of example, but we're going to have this, it's built just on the, or primarily there's functionality coming from the server side. So whereas all the addition for the previous one was done on the front side in Angular, in this one we have just a standard HTML form that it will submit an AJAX request back to our server. Our server has a route available to handle that AJAX request. It will take in the two values from the form. It will make sure that they're valid numbers, and if valid, it will return a result. If they're not valid numbers, then it will return, as part of the JSON object that comes back, an array of errors representing whether number one or number two has a problem. So let's just have a quick look on the client side. So this is a departure from what we've been looking at with Angular, and this is just a regular HTML file. You'll probably see a lot of similarities in what's happening between what we had in our component in Angular and what's going to be on this page. So we'll notice the base HTML file as part of our Angular application. You'll notice that these parts sort of up to about here is pretty much the same. In fact, it's an exact cut and paste from there. And you'll probably find from this section down is also relatively the same, where this portion of the page here will match up with the component or the app component which displayed the form on the page. The difference that we have in this one is primarily that there is a small amount of jQuery that I'm using here. This jQuery will be checking for the submission of the form. I'm going to be grabbing the two values or whatever values have been typed into that form. I'm going to generate an AJAX query here using the get method, and I'm going to be targeting the route on the server at API/addNums. I'll pass in my form data that I've generated, and I'm expecting my value to come back as JSON. This is then what happens when my AJAX query is done, that I will be checking the data field that comes back. So the data that's coming back will be a JSON object, which will have two fields. One is the result, and one is an error message. Or three, sorry. There'll be the result, a notice of whether it was successful or not, and an error message. So if the data coming back .success, so success within the JSON object was true, meaning we got a good value, then I grab the result out of the data value that gets returned, and I'm assigning that to a div with an ID of result, and I'm just zeroing out the div that is of ID errors to make it empty. Else, if it was not successful, then I don't show a result, and I loop through my errors array and display them inside the page. So very similar functionality that we had within the Angular app. So that's the client side. So primarily all we're looking at here is that it's going to send an AJAX request to this API or this API route, and it will be expecting to get back some data to then display on the page. So let's go and have a look now at our Node server and what it's doing. Okay, so we've included in here, we're requiring Express. I've got in here a require, there's a little function I've written which does the adding up of the numbers, and we'll look at that at a moment. I'm setting the result, so this will be the object that we will send back, or that we'll get from adding up our numbers, setting that to null. We're setting our success value to false. And this is, once again, the same methodology that we used for connecting our Angular app with our Node. I'm using the same methodology here of connecting this standard HTML page, which is all we're really doing when we're connecting to our Angular app from Node. So here I'm creating our static path to our index.html file that's within the client directory. So if we were doing this with Angular, we would be connecting this to something inside the distribution directory. So nothing different there. And given that index.html is a default file for a web server, we only need to notify the path. It will automatically add on the index.html. We don't need to expressly say that because it's a default file name. If you don't give it a name, it will automatically run that file anyway. So we have one route set up on this Node server, and so the route is the API addnums, which if you remember from our client side in our jQuery Ajax, that was the route we were targeting for sending back the form data. So we're going to call then our helper function. So here I had just created in an includes directory here a helper function. So this helper function of add nums takes in two numbers. We check that the number is nan, so is not a number. So I'm checking if it's not a number, or if the value is null, or if it's undefined, or if it's an empty string. Then we have a problem and we push an error string onto our error array. If our second number is not a number, or it's null, or it's undefined, or it's an empty string, then I put an error message into here. We could, if we want, test for each of these separately, so we could give more defined messages. So you could say whether it's not a number, you could say whether it's null or undefined, but for the moment I'm just doing one error for each of these results. Then I'm going to return a result. So if these were not numbers, then this result, really I don't care what it is when it comes back, because what I will be checking for is did we have any errors. So what will come back will be the result of this and the errors array. Okay, so we're coming back to our server.js. So the result of this will come back as a JSON object, which will hold the result and the errors array. So I'm checking here that if my errors array dot length was 0, meaning I had no errors, then I can say my success was true. Else, if there were errors, then my success was false. And what I send back to the client is going to be this JSON object. So I'm setting the result as whatever the result coming back from my add function was. I'll set success based on whether I had any errors, and I will send back my entire errors array so that I can use that back on my other form. Okay, we've got one too many of these down here. Okay, so that's just a run over of how this works. Now we want to look at doing the testing. So for testing, we're going to use Mocha. So to include Mocha, we need to do an npm install Mocha -- save to save it, or -- dev save for a development dependency. And we're going to be using the built-in JavaScript assertion library. Now there's a number of assertion libraries available out there, and you can add those in and use those assertion libraries if you wish. But for this time, we're just going to use the built-in Node assertion library. So let's have a look at some tests that we can run on this. So I've got about 8 tests here that I've predefined. We'll step through each of them. So, and all we're looking to test with this is that our addNums function, which is our helper one here, that it works properly. So my first one here is just an example of how to do our test. So we have, and this is just more JavaScript that we're writing here. So there is a function in the assert library called describe. Its first parameter is a string. So here we get to describe what our test is about. And its callback function, it then runs an it function. This its first parameter is a description of what this test is going to be about. And then we run the assertion as the callback function to that it. So this assertion or this it is always going to resolve to something that is true or false. You can either pass your test or fail your test. You can't half pass the test. So in this test, I want to do an assertion that this is always a true test, so that this should always equal true. So 1 is equal to 1. So I'm using the assertion library .equals. So I'm asserting that 1 is equal to 1. That is always going to be true. And so this test would always pass. I've then got a range of tests here that are looking at the different error issues that you might have with this test. So the first one, what I want to do is just pass through 2 valid numbers and make sure that the value that comes back is the result that we would expect. So my test, I'm going to test the addNums function. And for the it, I want 5 plus 5 should be 10. So I'm going to assert here that the helpers, and because we've included in here, so helpers.addNums, which calls this function here. So helpers.addNums passing in the values of 5 and 5 and its result, because remembering that this function here returns a JSON object. So we want the result value of this to be equal to 10. So that if this asserts to true, that 5 and 5, when they're added, results to 10, then this would be a tick and you would pass this test. The next test I'm looking at is testing to see that what happens if I do not add in the first parameter. So this means, so then I'm looking for my it, so I'm missing my first plus 5 should have, and in this way I want to be testing that I'm going to get an error message. So I'm asserting that the error, the length of the error message, so remember our object that is returned from my addNums functions is a JSON object. One of the objects in that is the errors array. If my errors array has a length of 1, meaning there is an error in there, then I'm asserting that I have that message. So this would get a tick. And then I want to check, I know that a message came through, but I'm not sure which message. So I could also, if you wanted to, be more specific and saying that the error message that comes back is number 1 is not a number. And so once again, we can check, we can assert that the text of the message that came back from that error is going to be equal to this string. And so then that would tick through. And I'm doing the same sort of things here on parameter 2. So I'm checking to see that there was an error came through, and I'm also checking to see that the message that came through is to say that number 2 is not a number. The next test I'm looking for here is that we've entered it in with no numbers at all, in which case we should get an error length of 2. So I'm just comparing here that if we have no numbers entered, we should get 2 error messages. And the last one I'm going to test, and this is one where we want to test that a string was a value sent through as a string. Actually, I should change this description because it's a bit misleading. So that if one of the values is a number and the other is a string, that we should get 1 error message. The way that I've done the helper function, we'll just quickly jump over here, is that I'm actually multiplying each of those numbers by 1, so that if the number that's sent through is a string representation of a number, so it was the number 5 as a string, then by multiplying it by 1, we'll convert it within JavaScript, we'll convert it to a number, and so that we'll be able to be comparing or adding a number with a number, even though one of them was a string representation of a number. But if it comes through as a string, which is like an ABC, then we should generate an error. And our test will be making sure that we get at least 1 message comes back to say that we had a problem with one of our fields. So let's go now have a look at actually running one of these tests. So before we can actually run the test, we've got to make a change in our package.json file. So that we need to tell it to run Mocha as our test runner. So we just need to make a change in here for our scripts test to add in Mocha as an option there. So once we've got that done, we can come into, let's go back to where this app is. So we have our files here that make up our stuff, and we want to run a npm test. And so this will go through, and we can see our test running here. Our first test here that we wanted to test that 1 was equal to 1. It should always be. If it's true, we get a tick. We want to test that our addNums functions was working, so that 5 plus 5 should be 10. We got a green tick. We want to test that the addNums function's missing data parameter 1, so it should have 1 error message. That was a tick, and that the error message was that. So you can see we've gone through all our tests have done, and we have passed. So let's go through and have a look at what happens if one of the tests does not pass. So let's make this last one, and we want to get an error message length of 3, whereas the answer should have been 2. So if we come back into here and we run our test again, then we'll see that we have 7 passing tests and 1 failing test. And the test that we've got a problem with, so the assertion, we're trying to assert that 1 was equal to 3 because there was only 1 error message and we were expecting 3. So this gives us a clue of where to go back to find out where that error was. And we'd either go in, potentially we should have written the test first, and then we match our code to meet the test requirements. We shouldn't actually be going back and changing our test to meet the code, unless you actually typed it in wrong to start with. So with all this testing, all we're doing is we're generating more JavaScript code to go through and make assertions on whether the values coming in or out of a function is as you would expect. So that is a very, very brief overview at looking at some unit testing using Mocha. Have a look at the assertion libraries. There's a lot of other functions available within the assertion libraries to do different types of tests. have a look at some of the other libraries out there, particularly I think the Chai, CHAI library is a good one, and you might want to try using that one for stuff that you might want to do in assignments. Okay, thank you.